Hi, in this video I'm going to talk a little bit about how movement works in the game. Before I talk about movement, I want to talk a little bit about how you place your tanks and armoured fighting vehicles in the hex. So one of the core components to the game is the orientation or the facing of the counter within the hex that it's within. So I'm going to use this hex as an example. When you place your counter and you move your counter through the hexes, the orientation or the facing of the counter is absolutely critical. The reason for that is around how combat works. So during the war, World War II period, generally speaking, the armour the tanks had was always, generally speaking, thicker at the front than the side and the rear. To reflect that in the game, when you place your counter, you place it facing, I'll call it the apex point of any side of the hex. So in this example, you would face it this way, so facing the apex point, just there, like that, or like that, or like that, or like that, or like that. What you don't do is do that, because then it's not facing the apex points. It's facing the sort of side, I'll call it. So you would orientate your counter to face that point there, for example. What that means is the front of the tank or the vehicle is those two hexes there, the side is those two hexes there, and the rear, can't quite move my fingers, those two hexes there. And that represents, when being fired upon, what side of the vehicle or the tank is being hit. So it's really important when you move your counter from one hex to another, you think about the orientation, the facing of the counter within the hex. So one of the key differences between this game and the previous Until the Bitter End games, the other games focused on infantry. That wasn't a thing, but in this game it most definitely is. So for example, just to illustrate the point, let's suppose this Panzer IV is firing on the Sherman there. It's firing directly into the hex of its side. If it was there, it'd be firing into the front as the line of sight passes through the front hexes. If the Panzer IV was lucky enough to be able to fire from the rear, it'd be firing into the rear as it passes through those two hexes there. If ever there's any doubt, if you're not sure between you and your opponent if it's firing into the front or the side, remember it's the hexes around that passes through. It will help, but if still there's doubt and it's 50-50, it'll always be to the advantage of the defender. So with that in mind, when you move your counter, you have to remember that orientation, that facing within the hex. Especially, just generally. Most movement for the armoured counters is 4 points. Most of them have 4 points. Some have 5, a couple have 3. And a few have special rules, we'll come to that in a second. That means it has 4 movement points it can spend. So let's say in this example, the players pull out a chip, it's an allied chip, and the allied player decides he wants to, this Sherman's out in the open here as a sitting duck, so he's going to move it into some cover or behind some cover, using that cover to block line of sight to his opponent. It has 4 movement points, that's the number in the bottom left there, the counter. To cut the movement to go into a clear hex costs 1 point, so it can move 4 hexes. 1, 2, for example. Player's quite happy with it is there. You don't have to spend all the points. You can't carry any over. As a matter of good form, let's say there's a Panzer. Let's put it where camera can see it. Let's say there's a Panzer IV there. Has a snap fire counter on it, and I'll cover snap fire in a different video. Every time you move, once you've finished your move, give the opposing player time to declare if they want to do a snap fire or not. snap fire basically is a opportunity fire at moving targets that move within the line of sight. And that's partly also why that orientation is important, because as you move your counter, as part of that movement, you can freely change the orientation of the counter in the hex. So if you wanted to, for example, in this case, you can move from there to there and keep the same orientation, or completely change the orientation if you so desire. It doesn't matter. There's no sense of the tank having to move straight ahead. It can move in any hex it wants to, regardless of its orientation, because you can move, change orientation at any point during the movement. Changing orientation also classes as movement. So let's say, for example, in this case, there's an opposing player with a Panzer IV here that's able to target the rear of that Sherman. The allied player pulls out a chip. They can activate this tank here and use movement simply to rotate the counter within the hex, and then thus presenting the front of the armour to the opposing Panzer IV. Once you finish movement, it's also important that you place a moving counter either on top or underneath, whatever your personal preference is. For example, like that. That's used because if that counter's fired upon and it's moving, there is a negative to the firing counter, and that is not removed until the next time, which will be in the next turn at best, that you will activate that counter. So remember, when moving, keep that on until the next time that counter is activated. Movement costs, generally 1 point for clear hexes, depends on the scenario. For example, it's particularly muddy or rainy, there may be a case in the scenario where it's 1.5 movement points to move into a clear hex, for example. You can also move into trees, tree lines and foliage hexes, and they cost 2 movement points. There may be some examples depending, on some of the maps that I made that I'll probably do in addition to this straightforward example here, where again there's different movement costs per hex content. It's based on the hex content, and that will be fully described in the rulebook. But generally speaking, 1 point to a clear, 2 points into a hex that's not clear, I'll call it, such as the tree line. Moving uphill, there's a hill in this here. Moving uphill costs 2 points as well. Now there are some counters that have a movement with a red dot. So let's use this Jagd Tiger, for example. These are particularly heavy, slow, cumbersome vehicles, armoured fighting vehicles in the war. If it has a red dot, it means there's a special rule specific to that counter when performing that action. So the red dot on the Jagd Tiger means that every time you move, you have to roll a dice to see if it gets stuck, as they were prone to do because of their weight and the way they were engineered or their performance. There are examples where there are specific rules to those. There aren't too many counters with those. It's mostly in this game, it's the German real heavy tanks such as the Jagd Tiger, the Tiger II. And again, they will be fully described in the rulebook. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of movement. I've designed it very deliberately to be very straightforward. The key thing that makes this game a little different than other games in the series. Again, it's just remembering that orientation in the hex, keeping the front specific to an apex point on the hex. So that is good. That will be confusing, and when you come to work out where it can be hit or where it's firing from, you'll have to move it. So keep it orientated in the hex, like that, or like that, or like that, etc. I hope that makes it clear. Yeah, thanks for watching.